Today on Day of Discovery, In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon.
Welcome to In His Footsteps with Day of Discovery. I'm Jim Cantelon. I'm sitting just outside the last remaining wall of the temple that Jesus would have known back in his time and ministry. He was not only Son of God and Son of Man, but he was very aware of the fact that his Father had an interest in the temple, a big interest in the temple. And just after his triumphal entry, he discovered all kinds of other people with interest in the temple, commercial interests in the temple. And so he comes in just after the triumphal entry, and he starts driving everybody out. It's quite a story. It shocks people. They don't expect Jesus to be this way, but he certainly acted with righteous indignation. Joining me after the Bible teaching will be Claire Pfann, Dr. Claire Pfann, a university professor, very informed about things like this, and she'll be filling in a lot of the gaps that I leave, and it's going to be a terrific half hour. So don't you go away. I'll be back with the Bible teaching right after this break. I'm sitting here in front of an old storefront, which would be part of the temple complex back in Jesus' time. When we read about and taught about Jesus' triumphal entry, I didn't mention then, we're going to see it now, that Jesus came right along here and started casting everybody out of the temple. You say, well, what's up with that? Well, let's read it first and then I'll explain. Jesus went into the temple of God. This is Matthew 21, verse 12. And drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, overturned the tables of the money changers, and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves. Well, this seems to be very uncharacteristic behavior on Jesus' part. You know, gentle Jesus, meek and mild. We say, you know, he was always kind, always soft in his answers, never offended to the point of anger. Well, here's a case in point where that is not the stereotype. I need to just give you a little background here on commerce in the temple. There was much more to the temple than the inner sanctum, much more than the Holy of Holies. The temple was a complex, and it had porticos. It had, you might call it patios or verandas or porches. There was the court of the Gentiles, where Gentiles were allowed in. But then there was the area that was exclusive to the Jews, where Gentiles were not allowed. But here's the interesting thing. The chief priests and the chief priestly family were all Sadducees at this point in time in Jesus' life. The Sadducees were a division in Judaism where their theology was liberal, where they didn't believe, like the Pharisees did, in the resurrection, where they were, you might say, intellectually elite. They had a sense of entitlement, where they expected their chief and high priest to live in a palace. It was, you know, a huge commercial enterprise. And they managed, overruled, and controlled all of the commerce that surrounded the temple. Now you say, well, what kind of commerce would that be? Well, figure this one out. The population of Jerusalem was about 25,000 people in Jesus' day. During Passover, for instance, one of the feasts where all the men of Israel were required to come to the temple, there might be as many as 100,000 plus who would come in to Jerusalem, swelling the population hugely. Not all of them would bring a lamb or a goat for a sacrifice. They fully expected when they got here, they would buy one here. They had, you know, kind of departed from the original idea of bringing the purest lamb of one's possession. But, you know, the sacrificial system had morphed over time, and it was still seen as perfectly legit to come into the temple area, buy what you could afford. Some people could afford only a dove, but buy some living creature and then present it to the priests when your moment comes for the absolution of your sin, atonement, and the beginning of a new life of freedom from sin for at least a period of time. Well, every one of these animals costs money. And there were merchants who not only dealt in animals, but they dealt in other things, including souvenirs, little memorabilia. I mean, some people came into Jerusalem once or twice or three times a year from far away, from up in the Galilee, or from down near Beersheba in the south, or from over on the coast near Jaffa. They weren't often here. And so there was this, I want to have some memorabilia. I want to have something that I can remember Jerusalem by. So you had all these guys, and that's, one of these storefronts here. Who knows what they were selling here? So whether it was sacrificial animals, or whether it was trinkets, or whether it was some sacred or semi-sacred parchment writing, whatever the case may be, they would sell it. And the Sadducean high priestly family got a cut. Are you following me here? This was something that was just as commercial can be. Now, Jesus knew this. He'd been here as a boy. He'd come in here maybe one other time. He only came to Jerusalem, as far as we know, 3 times, but he was fully aware of what was going on. This time he'd had it. He had semi-revealed himself, if you will, as Messiah with the triumphal entry, but now he was basically declaring, this is my Father's house, and we will not put up with this rank commercial trade. That's basically what was happening here. And so Jesus, he started turning up the tables of the sellers. There were money changers here, because you come in, you want to buy a goat, you got some kind of foreign currency, you change your money, the money changer makes a cut, the Sadducees make a cut of your cut. That's how it works. So money changers, those selling animals, anybody doing commerce, you can believe it, Jesus not just upset them, he upset the Sadducean elite, the chief priest and his family, who were overseeing all of this lucrative business. That's what's going on here with Jesus, the table turner. There's nothing less than that. And this was another reason why, when Jesus finally was brought before the chief priests, when he was brought to Caiaphas, for instance, Caiaphas was looking for any reason to get rid of this troublemaker. Now, I know that sometimes we can look at church history, and we can say, a lot of times actually, and we can say, well, the prime mover for much of this church ministry throughout the ages was money. We can look at some periods in the history of the church where it was very corrupt, where indulgences were being sold. For X number of dollars, you could avoid purgatory, or you could buy freedom out of purgatory for your friends and relatives with a certain amount of dollars. This was part of what fed the Reformation. And I'm not saying that all of church history was that way, but there's been a lot of church history that has been commercially motivated. Certainly you look at church properties today, and sometimes you say, well, what's going on here? The disciples themselves, on one occasion, when a woman came to Jesus and anointed his feet with an expensive perfume, said, what's going on here? That money, that could have been sold for money, and it could have been given to the poor. And it was on that occasion that Jesus said, the poor you'll have with you always. So we have much to consider when we look at Jesus, the table turner. Apologies for all of the noise as people walk by me here, but that's part of the life that we live here in Jerusalem. Final comment. Jesus acted alone here. His disciples weren't working with him. They didn't join him in this table turning. It was Jesus, and he was full of fury. He was acting as fully man, even as he was fully God. And if there ever was a moment in history where there was such a thing as righteous indignation, it was this moment. Okay, we're going to take a little break here. And when I come back, Dr. Claire Pfann is going to be with me. Dr. Claire Pfann is a university professor. She is very knowledgeable, and she's going to fill in some of the blanks for me. And hopefully, by the time this half hour is gone, you'll have a greater 3D understanding of the triumphal entry. So just stay with me. Right after this break, Dr. Pfann will join me.
And now we return to In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon on Day of Discovery.
Sitting here in the beautiful early evening within the city walls of Old Jerusalem, the western wall is just a few hundred meters over my left shoulder, and it's become quite quiet here. We've been doing all of our interviews here through a lot of noise, a lot of rejoicing, all kinds of things happening, but that's Jerusalem. It's a city of action, and I appreciate your patience through some of our other segments where it's been a little bit noisy. Professor Claire Pfann is with me. She has been commenting on several of the topics over the course of this series, and she's back now after a few weeks away. We're talking about Jesus the Table Turner. First of all, Claire, welcome back. Always a joy to have you on
Likewise.
The program.
Great to be here.
Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and there's this huge kerfuffle. Everybody is keen. I mean, we don't know, thousands, we don't know, but people greeting him. And as he's coming in, according to Matthew, he's fulfilling something that was stated years, like centuries previous, by Zechariah, when he says, "Tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." Maybe a touch unkingly, but I'm wondering if the people were aware of this Zechariah passage and saw that being fulfilled in Jesus coming into the city. What do you think?
I think that you hit the nail on the head with the tension that exists in the scene itself between the desires of the followers of Jesus and the crowds who have gathered as he made this long journey down from the Galilee, through the Jordan Valley, up through Jericho, and the numbers grow so that Luke says he's got a multitude, and they want to proclaim him king. They think he's the Messiah. They are throwing their robes on the ground before him. They've got olive branches, and they've got palm branches. John adds that detail, which really, palm branches connect with the triumph of the Maccabees, which was the last independent Jewish dynasty.
Right.
So there's definitely this desire to make him king. But when Jesus sits on the donkey, and both Matthew and John mention that this is in fulfillment of Zechariah, that he comes mounted on a donkey, lowly and meek and humble. He is a king who's coming to bring peace, not to bring a sword, not to bring war. And it's a response by him to their ideas of what kind of king are you going to be. He's not going to be a king that fulfills their expectations.
He comes into the temple and starts driving all of the commerce out. So he wasn't portraying himself as a king of peace at that point, was he?
No, and that's kind of an amazing thing when you think about it, because that would have played right into the hopes and aspirations of the everyday people.
Because for sure, there'd be a lot of resentment on the part of the everyday person at the wealth of the Sadducean priestly class. I mean, these guys were getting a cut of all the commerce here. Caiaphas was living in a temple, I should say in a palace. It's still here. They were a cut above the average Jerusalemite. I wonder, in taking on the temple commerce here, Jesus wasn't sending a strong statement to the Sadducees.
Yes, I think there are probably several levels of importance in what he's doing, and one of them certainly is addressing the graft and the avarice of these high priestly dynasties. I mean, we should imagine them like political dynasties where power is passed off from father to son, to brother to son-in-law, in the case of the family of Annas and Caiaphas. Annas was the great high priest. He had 4 sons, all of whom became high priests, plus his son-in-law was high priest at the time that Jesus was executed. That's one of the dynasties. And external Jewish sources, including the Talmud, talk about the corruption of these families. They name them. They name, woe is me because of the family of Annas. Woe is me because of the family of Cathros, which is the people who have the burnt house in Jerusalem. Right. Because of their knives, because of their contracts, because of their extortion, because of their violence. So there's a recognition across the broader Jewish public at the time of Jesus of just how corrupt these high priestly families were.
As my father would say, it is ever thus, one thinks of the kleptocracies of the current age. And it doesn't matter where you look, it seems that there are kleptocratic dictator-type leaders who are fleecing their people and building up their hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts. it not only makes you angry, it makes you disappointed. I mean, will human beings never act in a more heavenly manner?
Yes.
Why this total graft, this selfishness, this self-interest?
Yes.
What do you suppose again, I'm asking to speculate, but this is the fun of history, and a lot of history is speculation, as we know.
A lot of it is.
A lot of it is speculation. Sure. You take a few facts, you try to fill in the gaps. I'm wondering what the feelings and the response of some of Jesus' keenest followers would have been. I mean, they must have, initially when there's all of the banners and the accolades and so on, they must have been thrilled. But then when he starts messing with the temple, they must have been shocked.
It's shocking. We know in Mark it says that they went and they closed the entrances to the Temple Mount so that people couldn't walk through, that they secured it. I mean, this is really a radical step to take over where something should be open for the entire public at large. I think the Am Haaretz, the everyday people who were Jesus's followers, were probably very excited that somebody was standing up for them and doing something radical. Jesus does this also to attract attention because he wants to enter into dialogue with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the elders, and this provokes a recognition that he is present. So it's a prophetic step. It's something that is speaking to a new era, and he is doing this in a way that is going to initiate the events of that week, the Passion Week, and the weekend of his death and resurrection.
Now, as I recall the chronology, I think Lazarus had already been raised from the dead. Am I correct there?
Yes.
It was that miracle that I guess was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the religious establishment's desire to kill Jesus. I mean, they figured if he keeps doing that, the whole world's going to go after him.
Yes, I would say that, especially because there were many Jewish healers, and there were many Jewish exorcists, and many Jewish traveling teachers. While Jesus was simply a person who went around, preached, and healed, well, that's annoying, but, he's not part of the status quo. But never had people raised people from the dead.
No.
This is a power that even Martha does not expect Jesus to be able to do this. She says, I'll see him at the end of time at the resurrection. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection. And she says, okay. But she says, don't open the tomb. He's been dead. She doesn't expect Jesus to do this. This ability to raise people from the dead is something so extraordinary that it is terrifying to the high priest.
Well, absolutely. So there's that negative momentum with regard to Jesus on the part of the established religious leadership. But then this temple cleansing thing. I mean, a few days later when he's standing in front of Caiaphas, I'm sure that Caiaphas is saying, this guy is a total bother. He's raising people from the dead, and he's ruining my business. Let's get rid of him.
Yes, and they fear that there's a groundswell of popular appeal that Jesus has with the everyday people, that this will become a messianic movement that will upset the status quo that the high priests have with Rome, because their philosophy of religious government is to maintain the peace with Rome. I scratch your back, you scratch my back, we'll keep the common folk calm and quiet, and there won't be any change. Jesus represents change. He's making a proclamation that this is not living up to what God is really wanting the temple to mean, and this isn't living up to what the heart of the Torah is.
When Gethsemane happens and the officials come to take him away, Judas, of course, betrays him with a kiss. But what I find interesting is you got representatives of the temple, constabulary, as well as representatives of the Romans. You have Rome and the temple working together to get rid of Jesus.
That's right.
And it shows that he was a threat to both the religious establishment and to the political status quo.
That's right. And Herod and Pilate become fast friends.
Yeah, they became friends.
They become friends. Yeah. This helps further, secure the status quo. And we know that Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas are both removed from office in the same year. And it has led people to assume that there's some type of, under the table cooperation that goes on between them to, manipulate and keep the balance of power with Rome and with the high priestly family cooperating with each other.
I'm thinking about you, the viewer, right now as you're listening to this, and some of you, what we're talking about here is no news because you've studied it, and you're fully aware of what we're talking about. For most of you, I'm sure this is a bit of a head scratcher because we're really digging a lot deeper than the sort of the surface knowledge of some of these events. But this is a good reminder, friends, to study your Bible slowly, and to have a good Bible dictionary, a good Bible commentary, and take your time, because there is stuff that can be discovered just by knowing who wrote what, when did they write it, what's the context, all those kinds of things that will give you more of a 3D picture of the scripture than you might get from just simply reading it. Claire, let's shift gears. We got 3 minutes here. Jesus is terribly upsetting. He upsets the Sadducees, upsets the Romans, upsets the Pharisees. Why doesn't he upset us? Why are we so easily in tune with him? And why is it that we can say to the world we love him? What's happened?
Well, the resurrection happens. And the resurrection is a transformative moment in all of human history.
Yeah.
The personalness of God, his love and regard for the individual happens. And we see that manifested throughout Jesus' earthly ministry.
Yeah.
He incorporates everyone, woman, man, rich, poor, it doesn't matter. Jew and Gentile, all are recipients of God's blessings through Jesus, if they just turn to receive what he has to offer, this personal relationship. And I think at the bottom of it all is the fact that God has no grandchildren. He only has children. And that relationship of becoming a child of God is expressed through the powerful saving death and resurrection of Jesus.
2 minutes, unfair question. So you have to give me the Reader's Digest condensed version. Why is Claire Pfann a believer today?
Oh, God showed his mercy to my family for generations.
Really?
And yeah. My mother was the first one who really came into this awareness that we could have assurance of our salvation. I grew up in a Catholic family, and my parents were the most godly people you could ever know. They loved him and they served him. But this assurance that you can really know that you belong to God with full assurance and that you're not going to slip out of his grasp. What came first to my mother as she was listening to Christian radio back in the 1970s, maybe 1970 to be exact. She started telling us kids, and we subsequently, just asked the Lord on our own to be our Savior and to be in our life. And I have to say that awareness of the all-encompassing love of God, how much he has done for us. He gave up his son to death. If God gave up his son to death, then what can separate us from God's love? That is something that should transform us so that our response and life in him is one based on love and freedom, not on fear, not on a spirit of or an attitude of unworthiness and being a slave, but based on the confidence that children have in a good, healthy relationship with their parents, that their parents won't abandon them.
John is one, friends, who says that God is love. And if there is one quality of God that needs to be constantly focused upon, it's his love for the world, and his love for you, and his love for me. Claire will be back with me in future programs, so you'll be looking for her. I'll come back with a close right after this.
And now we return to In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon on Day of Discovery.
I just want to get back to what Jesus said when he drove out all of these commercial entities from the temple compound. He said, "It is written, my house should be called a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves." The business of a temple was not goats and sheep and doves and sacred memorabilia and money changing. As much as the spiritual elite, the Sadducees, had made it such, Jesus is saying there is one bit of business in this place, and it's prayer. Communion with God. Prayer is something that is vital if you're going to be in a relationship with the Lord. He needs to hear from you, and you need to hear from him. In the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus taught his disciples how to pray. You all know the Lord's Prayer. Very brief, but it touches almost all of the vital points of need that we may have, and also all the vital points of acclamation of the Lord Most High. You don't have to waste a lot of words when you pray. In fact, Jesus talks about that on one occasion. He says, sometimes people think they'll be heard for their much speaking. He says, look, the Lord knows what you need before you ask of him. He knows your thoughts before you know them. So what's the point of prayer? I think ultimately, friends, the point of prayer is that, number one, we allow access to the Lord, to our lives through prayer, because we are free moral agents. Unless we invite him into that space where he's needed, he will not enter. Secondly, prayer is just as much, if not more so, about listening than it is about talking. I've had people ask me over the years, so what is prayer? I say, well, for me, prayer is 95% listening. I'm very brief in terms of my requests. Listen to the Lord, friends. Listen to him. Let him speak to your spirit. I'm Jim Cantelon. Thank you for watching. Be back with you again next time.
Join us again next week at this same time for another Day of Discovery. For more information about Our Daily Bread Ministries Canada, please visit us online at ourdailybread.ca.